wanted to kick off just at the highest level, just talking about the protagonists in your novel, Soft Boiled. Maybe you could introduce the main protagonists and what they mean to you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, it's I feel like I'm going to be like a literary scholar and professor right now. Like, it's actually technically not a novel. It's a work of nonfiction and memoir, but that's only, I'm not just being a jerk. Like, that's
Fair correction.
no, but it's important because like the main character, right, is as a real living person named Frank Streets, who, because of that, I mean, I think like writers with their fictional characters can get really attached to them and have meaningful relationships and connections with them. But as a writer of nonfiction, like, this is a real human being who I have the responsibility of presenting to a readership. And I take that responsibility really seriously. And beyond that, I mean, he's a really dynamic and interesting and complicated and generous person that I learned a ton about by spending time with him. And yeah, so Frank Streets, the real man who lives in West Virginia. Yeah, he's a central figure throughout this book. So in some ways, I think of it as a profile of him, as much as the book ends up being an investigation of myself. And I kind of, you've read it, you can see like I've used the dialogue between my portrayal of him and my portrayal of myself as a character, and in my investigation of our relationship, how we interact, and our feelings about certain things. So yeah, so I guess the short answer is he's really important to me. Yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, very important to establish that these are real people we're talking about, not characters. I personally am very used to only reading fiction. You have made a very short list of nonfiction books that I've read. So it's exciting for me to step into that world as well. And as you introduce Frank Streets to us, as the reader, one of the first things I noticed, it was in your introduction of him. The things around him seemed to be important. His job, and some of his hobbies, or the things in his office. How did the inclusion of Frank Street's items and interests influence his introduction to the reader?
It's a good question. I mean, I think if you walked into Frank Streets' den and saw the incredible amount of animal hides and mounted busts and assault rifles and traps. He's a prolific trapper, which I don't even own a gun. I've never hunted. I've never trapped anything. So it's just impressive. And not just in like that novel way of like, ooh, I've never seen this stuff, but just the sheer amount of it. And I'm guessing that's why you brought this question up, because it's like, it's in your face. It's an important way that I introduce this character to a reader. In some ways, I know that will be a catchy and novel kind of portrait of this person and his relationship to, I guess, his own kind of masculinity in that way. So I felt like that was important upfront to say, my first time meeting Frank Streets, this is how he chose to introduce himself to me in a way. Because he said, come on in through the carport. This is my office. And you literally have to walk through his den, which is just covered with all of this, like you said, items or tokens of masculinity, right? In a traditional sense. And I thought that, well, that's how he introduced himself to me in a way. So I thought that was a good way to bring a reader into this really somewhat exotic world for me, at least. Someone who, grew up in Western New York, like I mentioned, but just a minute ago, never held a gun, a very different relationship to hunting and trapping and that kind of outdoorsman lifestyle. So I thought that was important because it quickly would show, and I kind of show this in that scene, how I felt uncomfortable and kind of taken aback and out of my element too, right? So I thought that was a key way for me to show how Frank Streets wanted to display himself, but also how it affected me internally and emotionally to be in that kind of a space and kind of a dialogue of versions of masculinity or manhood, right? So.
Yeah, no, it definitely felt a little bit like the pen and the sword contrast, where you have the glasses and the writer and the pen, versus the tools that might be more traditionally aligned with masculinity, like hunting and guns and etc. So definitely felt that in the intros, and I could feel myself walking into the office and it painted a really clear picture over that distinction. The other thing I wanted to touch on in Frank Streets is his pursuit of or pursuit and goals of a certain ideal. Like your pursuit in the book felt clear as you were pursuing your writer's dream, and he had his goals as a detective. What can you tell me about like the pursuit in general, chasing a goal, chasing a dream, living up to some version of a man that kind of you respect in your own head, and how might those be different between you or the same?
Okay, it's a complicated question. It's good though. It's hard for me to answer that for Frank, really, other than what I observed of him. And his, he always wanted to make sure that I always heard that he was committed to pursuing justice and being just. And that was even why he had started his career after the military as a sheriff's deputy in the same county in West Virginia where he currently lives. And he had said it was just too corrupt. The police, like all that was too corrupt for him. So this is how he introduces or answered my question about like, how did you get into private investigation? And he thought it was a better way for him to pursue justice. So I think that in some ways that's what he thinks he's after, or at least, I mean, I can't question if it's accurate or not, but that's how he is telling himself, this is the work that I'm doing and it's good work. I think that there are times when, anyone is pursuing a goal, you can kind of make some decisions that could be unethical or questionable because sometimes achieving that goal is seemingly more important than anything else, right? And I think that can be something that I can relate to in my own pursuits as a writer, not necessarily so much as like making unethical choices, but even the idea of trying to find a way to write a book as someone who had always identified as a creative person, an artist, a writer, and concerned I didn't really have material that was worth writing about. So there's some kind of insecurity there and some fear, right? So again, I don't necessarily think it's unethical, but like, how about like, I find this incredible real life superhuman detective in West Virginia and focus on him in the writing as a way to kind of fulfill what I found as a lack within myself of not having good, authentic material or interesting enough story. So Frank Streets becomes the kind of person that I write about. And I think that anytime a writer focuses on someone else, you have to be cognizant of how you're portraying them, right? And that was a real concern for me in writing the book, was to be fair to Frank and to try to present him not just as like a superhero, but also as a flawed person too. And if I was going to question anything about his pursuits of his goals, I felt like it was super necessary for me to also question my own pursuits, my own interests, my own choices. I felt like that was a fair trade and something that would allow me the permission to investigate him a little bit if I was very dedicated to the investigation of myself and my own goals and pursuits as a writer.
Yeah, no, that feels balanced as portraying him as a dynamic, complicated person, as we all are. Because I could see it be easy to slip into like just using him as like a contrasting backboard, right?
Yes.
Where it's just always kind of a homogenous or one-dimensional character. And so I humanizing him was really clear in the novel, that you knew this person on a level deeper than just kind of the outward appearances. There was a quote that I picked from one of your prior interviews that I just want to read, because it seemed to hinge on this distinction between toxic masculinity, which we hear a lot about but don't really know what it is, and healthy masculinity. And so it's read. It's from Michael Kimmel. And the quote is, "The manhood of the future cannot be based on obsessive self-control, defensive exclusion, or frightened escape. We need a new definition that's more about the character of men's hearts and the depths of their souls than about the size of their biceps, wallets, or penises. A definition that is capable of embracing differences among men and enabling other men to feel secure and confident rather than marginalized and excluded." What do you think about this quote in I read it as like inclusion is kind of the key variable that changes toxic masculinity to healthy masculinity. Are there elements in your book where you kind of see maybe these two sides of the coin, an unhealthy masculinity that might not be so healthy for those involved, and or maybe some behaviors that were very healthy?
Yeah, it's good. I really love that quote too. This Kimmel book is something that I return to periodically throughout the book too, because he's written a really interesting study. Basically, it's like about uh, white straight American men mostly, right? And kind of the history of influences that have led that, I don't know, that group, that demographic,
Hmm.
to have certain behaviors and traits. I don't know if it's a certain kind of like contemporary toxicity, right? Like I love that you point out that, like, what do we even know what that means? And that it's thrown around so often. I don't know if it's considered deeply, but I do think that your idea of it being about inclusiveness is important, right? Some kind of new, I don't know, a new kind of updated masculinity. I think inclusion is good. And for me, that is akin to openness too. And that's kind of how I tried to embrace and practice it in the writing of the book, was being as open and earnest and authentic as I possibly can be, especially with writing nonfiction. Like, it would be easy to shape myself as a character on the page um, in a way that is sidestepping some of the parts of my own personality and actions that I'm uncomfortable with.
Hmm.
Very easy to just edit those out, right? Um, but I felt like, for me, being open about decisions I've made, actions I've taken that I'm not proud of, that I don't think are positive, even healthy for myself or others. I think it was important in this book in particular, because of its focus on masculinity, to reveal that. And not just once, but like anytime it would come up, try to reveal my own flaws, be open and honest about it. And for me, that's inviting more people, more men, I guess you could say, to relate to it, hopefully. Um, you may say, well, you know, I don't know if I could be that open, or I don't know if people have said, like, if this is really brave to share all this stuff. It's a book, people can read it now. I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's part of the project, right? I feel like that's my interpretation, how I'm presenting myself, being as open as I can to a reader about my actions, my feelings, my experiences in the book, is a way I'm trying to put into practice this quote that you just shared from Kimmel, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I
Um,
mean, I think also with inclusivity comes vulnerability, and it
right.
takes so much strength to do that. And being sharing is such a strong indicator that you can share what you're feeling or mistakes you've made and gather community. Like the only way to get community and people relating to it is sensing someone being honest and vulnerable. Um, One of the ones that really stood out to me was you wrote a few passages on your intrusive thoughts, and actually with enough detail that like we could see your intrusive thoughts,
Mhm.
and they're definitionally very uncomfortable. I don't think I've ever seen someone write down the content of their intrusive thoughts because they're so heavily stigmatized. So why was this inclusion of like a even just a small piece of like a mental health battle or obstacle, why was that
Mhm.
important to include?
I think I think you just answered it in some ways, right? Because it's so often stigmatized, and I think can be a real source of um, continued problems for people if they continue to repress and suppress those feelings, intrusive thoughts. Try not to acknowledge them. I think that can be problematic, and I think it relates to the answer I gave before. It was really important to me to be open, and for a reader to trust the openness that I'm displaying on the page. I felt like I couldn't censor anything, even some of these like early intrusive thoughts that still haunt me, right? And I think by sharing them, I think you can form community, because there's a belief I have, and this is a belief as a writer of nonfiction, that if you write your personal story, your personal experience, it becomes universal in a way. So the more particular and more specific you get, you can actually open up to more and more audiences that can relate to it. So I have this kind of faith that by sharing that, sure, my intrusive thoughts may not be the same as yours or anyone else's, but it's common enough, and I think it should be talked about more often and brought to the surface, because that helps process, that helps move forward, helps gain perspective, helps growth, I believe. At least it has for me. It's actually funny too, because that's the section of the book where my mom's had to stop reading when I started sharing these intrusive thoughts, because they're depicted from when I was, an adolescent. The first time I kind of encountered these really heavy, serious intrusive thoughts, and she never knew about it.
Yeah.
And that was a real hard thing for her to think about. Her child who's experiencing this privately and never knowing about it. So I actually, what's neat though is it gave us an opportunity to have a conversation about it. I could be like, Mom, I'm okay. Like, it's okay. And actually, this is proof of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's so cool that you were able to have that conversation so many years later, and sharing not just with her, but with so many people, and it kind of wraps her up in it. That's really cool. The other experience you discussed in your book was your experience. I mean, we kind of got to see your experience as a father play out in the book, and you're kind of grappling with a few things like your identity as like the lone writer versus a father, or just time, like how much time do I have to write versus take care of my child, and with your partner, where her career is going, and the balance between like being with her or your child. So tell us a little bit about how that transition was. Did it change how you thought about yourself, for like as your identity? You changed how you thought about your own masculinity?
Do you mean like the change of becoming a father, having a kid? Yeah.
So you became a father. How did that change?
Yeah, right. Like, well, this is one of those like rites of passages, right? Like, hey, there, fatherhood, like parents, right? Like, here you go. I think I had not ever really thought about, a definition of manhood that I felt comfortable with before having a kid, having a child, right? It's not like I had a real clear cut, like, this is what a man looks like, does, acts like, this is the job, this is, I don't think I ever really had a concrete relationship to that anyway. At least not explicitly, or kind of like in a reflective way. But once our son was born, and my spouse is a very high achieving, highly successful individual, and it was paramount that I supported her. And in the book, I talk about some trauma, some physical trauma, her losing her vision. At the same time, she's starting a full-time tenure track position, and it was not even a question. I was like, I have to put aside my aspirations, and I didn't contextualize them in terms of masculinity at the time or manhood, just in terms of my own kind of dreams, goals, aspirations. I had to put those aside to take care of the current situation of the people that needed my care and responsibility, and me to be present with them. And that was a hard thing to do, because I was at this critical point in my own career development that I felt a ton of pressure to perform, right? To write a book, publish things, basically check the boxes that proved that I was on my way to the career I'd always hoped for myself. So that was the real challenge for me. And I guess, like, in reflection, that's a measure of, my own masculinity being in crisis, right? Like, some people in my life, a spouse and a child, complicating my desire, not just my desire, but my ability, like you mentioned, time, energy to pursue those things. And it never was a hard thing. Personally, it felt right. I cared about these people. It was right. But when I would think about what, how it was slowing me down on this career track, that was hard to manage. So it's kind of, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but
no, so that's exactly the kind of expansion on the question I was looking for. And I want to be, I know we only have a few more minutes scheduled, and so I wanted to kind of open the floor a bit and just ask, as this book developed into an exploration of your own masculinity, Um, what did you learn? I think anyone doing some level of introspection, especially on this level, like looking inside, checking in with yourself, is not something that's comfortable for a lot of us. And for you to have spent so much time in writing your book, um, is there anything you can share from the lessons you learned in that time?
Sure. So that's a big question. It's tough to answer. I think what I learned is that it's been worth it, to take what I felt like was a risk to reveal so much of my personal life and the struggles that I was going through at a period of time in my life, with my spouse as a new parent, someone who wasn't quite sure-footed yet in my career, um, but doing it with that kind of earnestness and openness that I've been describing. That what I would consider somewhat of a risk. I've learned that it was worth it, because of conversations I've had with people who have read the book, um, that I think, um, it. I think my honesty in the book has helped them feel comfortable with me in some way. Like they know me better. Like I don't like they know me and are comfortable with me talking about things that, I'm actually surprised by still. So, and I have a little story I can share with you about. I actually drove down to visit Frank Streets again. I hadn't seen him in like 8 years, and I had gotten an advanced review copy of Soft Boiled and mailed it to him to read, and he'd never read any part of it. He knew I was writing a book, but he had no idea what it would turn into. It was a 10-year process, right? So I sent him the book and I drove down. This was just a few months ago. And I wasn't, I don't know. The fact that he was okay with me visiting, I knew it was going to be all right. Like he wasn't, totally dismayed by what I'd written about him or about myself or whatever. So, but I ended up staying there and talking with him for 7 hours.
Wow.
I tried to leave. He just wouldn't let me leave. Like he just kept telling me more and more stories about himself. He ended up telling me stories about his childhood, about abuse he endured. He told me stories that he said, quote, I haven't even told my wife about this. And
Wow.
then he said, and at one point, I don't even know why I'm sharing it with you. And I was just stunned, right? And I'm getting emotional thinking about it now because what it told me was that he didn't talk about the themes of masculinity or the investigations of gender theory or even a lot of like my own self-scrutiny in the book. He wanted to talk about the details of the cases and, make sure I had the facts right. But the fact that he started to open up to me about these abuses from his past and some things that he had listened to and talked to his son about, um, some emotional trauma and things that he endured as a veteran, incredible stories. But I realized that while he wouldn't explicitly talk about those, investigations of masculinity and the Michael Kimmel quote, those kinds of ideas, the fact that he was willing to open up and share means it resonated in some way.
Hmm.
And that's what I learned is that it was, when I say it was worth it, um, I hope that it can do that for other readers too.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it shows that you opening and being vulnerable can trigger that in other people, and that's real connection,
Yeah.
which is what we all strive for. And that you really saw him, like you spent a lot of time and a lot of care and respect in writing about him.
Yeah.
Um, and then and the soft boiled cover. Maybe if there's something you want to talk about there, we could talk about that because
I can answer it really quickly with the cover.
sure.
I actually got to work with one of my great friends that go way back to when I was in art school. Her name is Libby, and she's a fantastic designer. And I reached out to her and I was like, would you help me design a cover for this book? And she was very excited about that. So actually the busts on the cover are from a photo I took of in Frank's den, and she
Awesome.
converted those to these like graphic illustrations. And before we had the soft, in pink and cursive, it was just this like really bold text, and I thought like, well, you got to have a gun on the cover. It's so fun, it's like very fun, kind of inside joke for me. And then she also asked me to share a bunch of the notebooks because I'm a kind of obsessive like a documentarian of process. And so these are actual notebooks from when I was like on the beat with Frank Streets. And the choice to put the pink there, we wanted something to kind of pop. And of course, pink is a great color. I love pink, but as you probably suspect, it's like cueing some kind of conversation about gender norms. And I thought that that was just a kind of clever visual cue to like show someone that might pick up the book that, you know, this book is questioning some of the ways that we depict and think about gender, specifically masculinity. And I thought that counterpoint of a soft handwritten script with pink was a nice way to kind of, show that kind of theme.
Yeah, it tees it up nicely, and I think it's great to go along with the cover having your voiceover. I think that is worth it. And so I guess in the last few minutes, let's talk about the pee in the bottle scene, because
I'm so happy that you liked it. This is like a people that
to how we close the interview, because I've peed in many bottles on road trips, and I had never thought about. I guess I've only done it with like my little brother, and so it was always it was like comfortable. But here with a stranger, why was this important to include? Why was it a big deal?
Well, I thought it would further introduce the discrepancy in character between myself and Frank Streets, because the phone call before that first day that I rode along with him and we went on a stakeout of a suspected adulterer, he's like, well, we might just end up sitting in the truck for like 9 hours. And I was like, okay. And then he paused and he like, so you want to bring, some granola bars in a pee bottle? And he just said it very matter of factly. I'm like, oh, right. Yeah. And I tried to be cool. Like, yeah, of course I'll bring a pee bottle. And then I thought it would be entertaining and fun to kind of tease out and belabor the kind of crisis of picking a pee bottle to, pee in the front cab of a truck next to a stranger. Like, what do you do? Like, I have never had a pee, so I've never peed in a bottle before. So I thought that it would be fun to just kind of play out the self-doubt and fear of like what the bottle you choose means. Like, how does it represent me as a man, right? As a metaphorical kind of way to show these concerns I had about riding along with this like person who's working as a private eye, which is a really daring and dangerous line of work. And I'm like, the weenie writer, right? So it's like, I thought it was a great kind of opportunity to present the difference between Frank Streets and myself early to a reader, in a pretty entertaining way, I hope. But
for sure, it definitely stuck with me, and I could see having to plan it in advance, thinking about it and being more nervous about it than I probably should be, with some kind of like choice paralysis with the bottles.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So it was awesome, and I think it's a great soundbite. Adds some humor to the whole exploration. So thank you for taking the extra time to answer the two.
No problem. Yeah.
Cover and the pee bottle.
Yeah. Gotta like make sure that's a huge, like a very important topic, right? Yeah. That's good.
That's awesome. Well, so those were the ones I wanted to cover. Those are kind of the fun ones. It was awesome to get to meet you. It was really awesome reading your book and then brainstorming with the Under the Hood team, coming up with these questions. Like you said, it inspired the conversations that we had. And so for us, it was really a special experience to like read something we're all interested in the same way, and kind of coming from someone who spent a lot of time, 10 years thinking about it and writing it. It was definitely a privilege.
Well, yeah, and honestly, thank you for being open to reading it and having me participate in this. I think it's super cool. And I mean, I was excited for this, and I'm happy with how it's gone. I hope I didn't give you too much content or make it hard for you to edit it. I hope your job is easy, especially with your new graduate career beginning.
It's a good problem to have. It's a good problem to have with the content.